Every good fraud is built out of exactly the material its target already trusts. Show a romantic a love letter, and he'll believe it, however clumsy the phrasing, however familiar the promises. Show an engineer a spreadsheet, a notarized agreement, and a laminated binder full of projected returns, and he'll believe that too, more completely than any love letter could ever manage, precisely because he has spent a lifetime training himself to distrust the former and trust the latter, without ever questioning whether the latter could be counterfeited with equal skill. This is the story of a retired process engineer who spent his entire career distrusting emotion and trusting documentation, and what happened when someone built an entire fraud, specifically out of the one thing he could never bring himself to doubt. I spent 38 years as a process engineer for a large industrial firm outside Rotterdam, the kind of career built on precision, on never signing off a proposal until every number in it had been independently verified, on treating a colleague's enthusiasm as interesting but ultimately irrelevant information compared to what the actual data showed. I spent the better part of 2 decades in optimization work specifically, the kind of role where a single overlooked variable in a production line could cost the firm hundreds of thousands of euros, and I built a genuine reputation across those years as the engineer who caught the detail everyone else had missed, who asked for the underlying data behind a claim rather than simply accepting the claim's conclusion. I retired at 62 with a solid pension, a modest but comfortable portfolio I'd managed conservatively across 4 decades, favoring index funds and government bonds over anything resembling speculation, and a divorce from my wife, Annalise, that had finalized 11 years earlier, amicable enough by the end that we still exchanged Christmas cards. 2 people who'd simply grown into different lives after our daughter Ilse left for university, and the shared project of raising her no longer held us together the way it once had. I want to be honest that retirement suited me poorly at first, in a way I hadn't anticipated for a man who'd spent his whole life claiming he looked forward to it. 4 decades of structured problem-solving leaves a particular kind of hole when it's suddenly gone, and I filled the early months with the usual prescriptions, a woodworking course I attended religiously for 3 months before losing interest entirely, longer walks along the moss than I'd ever taken while working, a modest amount of consulting work that dried up faster than I'd expected once word got around that I was properly retired rather than simply between projects. Ilse, settled in Amsterdam with her own young family, called every week, dutiful and warm, asking careful questions about how I was filling my days that I answered honestly enough without ever quite conveying the full weight of the quiet that had settled into my flat. But I understood, without either of us saying it outright, that I wasn't a central figure in her daily life the way I'd once been, and that the specific ache of that recognition was mine to manage rather than hers to solve. I took my first trip to the Philippines at 63, following a recommendation from a former colleague, Wim, who'd retired there 2 years earlier and kept sending photographs that made Rotterdam's gray winters look considerably less appealing than they already did, images of beaches and markets, and a specific quality of light I found myself thinking about more often than I expected to, sitting in my own quiet flat watching rain streak down the window. I found the country genuinely captivating on that first visit, the warmth of it in every sense, and extended my planned 3 weeks into nearly 2 months before finally returning home, already calculating, with the same careful methodology I'd once applied to a production line efficiency problem, exactly how a longer-term arrangement might work financially, running numbers on a spreadsheet I kept updating for months afterward. I met Cheryl during my second extended visit, at a business networking event in Quezon City that Wim had dragged me along to more out of his own social habits than any expectation that I'd find anything professionally useful there. A room full of small business owners and aspiring investors that felt, initially, like exactly the kind of evening I'd have politely declined back in Rotterdam. She was 36, introduced herself as a franchise coordinator working across several small business ventures in the metro area. Sharp, articulate, entirely comfortable discussing return on investment figures and operational logistics in a way that struck me immediately as unusually substantive for a casual networking conversation, cutting through the usual small talk within the first few minutes to ask me, with genuine curiosity, What kind of due diligence process a process engineer would actually apply to a small business investment? I want to be honest that this was precisely what drew me to her. More than any conventional romantic spark, the specific, unusual pleasure of meeting a woman who could discuss capital expenditure projections with genuine fluency rather than polite indulgence, who seemed to find the actual mechanics of a business interesting rather than merely tolerable. We began seeing each other regularly over the following months, and I found myself, for the first time since Annalise, genuinely looking forward to a relationship that felt built on something more substantial than mutual loneliness. Conversations that ranged easily between personal history and, increasingly, the specific mechanics of various small business opportunities she was involved in coordinating across the city. I told Ilse about her during one of our weekly calls, and my daughter, ever practical, asked the obvious question. "Papa, are you sure you're not just excited because she talks like an engineer?" I laughed at the time, told her that was exactly the point, that after decades of finding most romantic conversation frustratingly imprecise, I'd finally met someone who spoke my actual language. I understand now, with the particular clarity retrospect always supplies too late to matter, that Ilse's question had been considerably more perceptive than either of us realized in the moment. The franchise opportunity surfaced around month 5, and I want to describe how it was presented with real precision, because the presentation itself is the entire substance of what happened to me over the following year. Cheryl didn't simply mention an investment idea over dinner, the way I understand many of these arrangements begin. She scheduled what she called a proper briefing, at a small conference room she'd arranged access to through her own professional network. An actual rented meeting space with a projector and a table long enough for 6 people, though only the 2 of us attended, and arrived with a binder, laminated, professionally bound, containing what looked, to every relevant standard I'd spent a career applying to exactly this kind of document, like a legitimate business proposal, complete with a table of contents and page numbers, the kind of formal structure I'd have expected from a properly prepared engineering submission, rather than a casual personal conversation. The binder detailed a water refilling station franchise, a business model I understood to be genuinely common and often genuinely profitable across the Philippines, given limited access to reliably clean tap water in many areas, a fact I'd independently verified through my own reading before ever meeting Sheryl, which only strengthened my confidence that the underlying business category itself was sound. The proposal covered territorial rights to 5 existing stations across Quezon City, projected annual returns of 22%, operational management to be handled by Cheryl's cousin, a man named Danilo, she described as a licensed franchise broker with a decade of experience in the sector, his credentials listed on a dedicated page, complete with a photograph and a brief professional biography. The binder included photographs of the 5 stations, clean, well-organized, clearly operational, along with a notarized master franchise agreement bearing an official-looking corporate seal, financial projections laid out in a spreadsheet format I recognized, with something close to professional admiration, as competently constructed, columns for revenue, operating costs, and net distributable profit that mirrored, almost exactly, the format I'd once used myself for internal capital proposals. I want to explain why this particular presentation worked so completely on a man who'd spent 38 years professionally trained to be skeptical of exactly this category of proposal. A man who once turned down a genuinely promising internal investment because a single supporting chart had used an inconsistent baseline year. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Every element of the binder addressed a category of due diligence I'd have insisted on for any comparable engineering proposal: verified physical assets, documented legal structure, projected returns supported by apparent historical performance data, a named operational manager with claimed relevant credentials, each box checked with the same precision I'd once demanded of my own junior staff. It never once occurred to me, sitting in that conference room, reviewing pages that satisfied every formal criterion I knew to apply, checking each one off almost unconsciously, the way I'd once checked off a supplier's compliance certificate, that the entire category of verification I was performing had itself been anticipated and specifically constructed to be satisfied. I visited 2 of the 5 stations myself before committing any money, a due diligence step I insisted on precisely because 38 years of engineering practice had taught me never to approve a proposal based on documentation alone when physical verification was possible, a lesson learned the hard way early in my career after a supplier's paperwork had once described equipment that, on inspection, simply didn't exist. A principle I stated to Cheryl almost proudly at the time, certain it demonstrated exactly the kind of careful rigor that would protect me from any possible deception. Both stations were real, functioning, genuinely busy with customers filling containers at the counter, staff working efficiently, the whole operation appearing exactly as legitimate and operational as the binder had described. The hum of the filtration equipment, the specific smell of clean, slightly chlorinated water, all of it registering to my trained eye as entirely authentic evidence of a genuine, functioning business. What I didn't understand, and had no reasonable way of understanding at the time, was that these stations belonged to entirely unconnected owners who had been paid a modest fee, a few thousand pesos each, according to what I later learned, to simply permit a foreign investor to tour their premises without asking too many questions about why. The corporate seal on the master franchise agreement, I discovered much later, had come from an ordinary stationery shop in Divisoria, the kind of shop that produces custom rubber stamps and seals for a modest fee, no verification of legitimate corporate registration required or, apparently, expected, a detail so mundane in its execution that it strikes me now as almost more unsettling than a more elaborate deception might have been. I invested 120,000 euros for territorial rights to the 5 stations, transferring the full amount in 2 installments over about 3 weeks. A structure Sheryl explained was standard practice for staged franchise buy-ins, allowing initial due diligence to be confirmed before the second, larger transfer, a structure that felt, at the time, like additional evidence of a properly cautious, professionally managed arrangement, rather than what I now understand it actually was, a mechanism designed simply to establish a working rhythm of trust before the full sum changed hands. I remember the specific satisfaction I felt signing that notarized agreement, the same particular satisfaction I used to feel approving a well-documented capital expenditure proposal at the firm, the sense of a decision made not on impulse or emotion, but on careful, verifiable evidence. Exactly the kind of decision I'd built an entire professional identity around being good at making. For 8 months, the returns arrived precisely as promised. 2,200 euros monthly, delivered in cash, brought to my rented condo by taxi on the same date each month. An arrangement Cheryl explained as simply how Danilo preferred to handle distributions to overseas investors, avoiding the delays and fees associated with international bank transfers, a taxi driver arriving each time with a sealed envelope and a receipt slip for me to sign, the entire ritual carrying just enough procedural weight to feel like a legitimate business practice rather than a performance staged specifically for my benefit. I kept meticulous records of each payment, the same careful documentation habit that had once tracked production line variances across a career, a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, running totals, and I remember showing that spreadsheet to Wim over drinks one evening, genuinely proud of the investment's apparent performance. Watching my own money, as I understood it then, generate a return considerably better than anything my conservative Dutch portfolio had managed across the preceding decade, Wim himself nodding along with real interest, mentioning that he might ask Cheryl about similar opportunities for his own modest savings. I understand now, with a clarity that arrived far too late to matter, that I was simply receiving my own capital back, laundered through a taxi ride, and dressed up as profit, a fact so cleanly disguised by the physical ritual of cash, arriving in an envelope that I never once, across 8 full months of careful documentation, thought to question where the money was actually originating from, the sheer mundane procedural normalcy of it functioning as its own form of camouflage. This is, I've since learned through the difficult process of researching exactly what happened to me, one of the oldest structures in financial fraud, an arrangement designed specifically to build confidence through early apparent success before the actual mechanism of the scheme, extracting new capital faster than any real business could ever generate it, inevitably runs its course. The first genuine crack in my understanding came around month 7, when I asked, during an otherwise ordinary conversation, whether I might visit the stations again, simply out of genuine curiosity about how the operation was developing, rather than any specific suspicion. Cheryl's response struck me, even in the moment, as subtly different from her usual easy fluency on operational matters. A slight hesitation, before she explained that Danilo was currently consolidating 2 of the 5 locations into a larger, more efficient facility, and that a visit during this transitional period would be premature and potentially confusing. I accepted this explanation at the time, the same way I'd have accepted a project manager's explanation for a temporary delay in a legitimate engineering timeline, filing it away as an ordinary operational detail, rather than the warning it actually was. The first genuine crack in my understanding came around month 7, when I asked, during an otherwise ordinary conversation, whether I might visit the stations again, simply out of genuine curiosity about how the operation was developing, rather than any specific suspicion, mentioning it casually over dinner, the way I might have once asked a project manager for a routine site update. Cheryl's response struck me, even in the moment, as subtly different from her usual easy fluency on operational matters. A slight hesitation, before she explained that Danilo was currently consolidating 2 of the 5 locations into a larger, more efficient facility, and that a visit during this transitional period would be premature and potentially confusing. A detail delivered with just enough specificity, a mention of permit delays with the local barangay, a contractor's schedule that had slipped by 3 weeks, to sound entirely plausible to a man who'd spent decades hearing precisely this kind of ordinary operational complication described in his own professional life. I accepted this explanation at the time, the same way I'd have accepted a project manager's explanation for a temporary delay in a legitimate engineering timeline, filing it away as an ordinary operational detail rather than the warning it actually was. Even noting in my own spreadsheet, with a kind of misplaced professional thoroughness, station consolidation in progress per D, revisit Q3. The payments stopped, without any warning or explanation, the same week that Cheryl's messages did, roughly 8 months after the initial investment, a silence that arrived with a completeness I found almost disorienting. After months of consistent, reliable contact, the daily rhythm of our messages simply vanishing overnight, as though a switch had been thrown somewhere I couldn't see. I messaged repeatedly across the following 2 weeks, calm at first, then increasingly direct, receiving nothing back, not even the brief, evasive responses that might have suggested she was simply occupied with some genuine complication. I contacted Danilo directly, using the phone number listed on the master franchise agreement, and found the number disconnected entirely, a dead end I initially attributed, with the particular optimism of a man not yet ready to accept what was actually happening, to a simple change of carrier or a temporary service issue, spending an entire evening searching for alternative contact methods before finally admitting to myself that none existed. I flew to Quezon City about 3 weeks after the silence began, unable to resolve anything remotely useful through remote communication, and went directly to the address listed on the franchise agreement for what the document described as the coordinating office, a taxi ride I remember taking with a specific, mounting dread I hadn't fully allowed myself to name yet. I found, instead of an office, a small residential building with no business registration of any kind, a landlord who informed me, through a translator I'd hired for exactly this purpose, that no company matching the name on my agreement had ever operated from that address, that the space had been rented briefly, months earlier, by a woman matching Cheryl's description, for what the landlord had understood at the time to be a short-term storage arrangement, rather than any ongoing business operation. I visited the two stations I'd originally toured, and this is the moment I've come to think of as the actual collapse of the entire structure I'd built my understanding around. More than the silence, more than the disconnected phone number. The stations were exactly as busy and legitimate as they'd been on my original visit. The same hum of filtration equipment, the same steady flow of customers, and the owner of the first station, a genuinely kind man named Rodrigo who seemed as confused by my questions as I was by his answers, explained, once my translator had properly conveyed what I was actually asking, that he had no franchise agreement with anyone, that he owned the station outright, had built it himself over several years of careful saving, starting with a single machine and expanding gradually as his own modest profits allowed, and that yes, he did recall a foreign visitor touring the premises some months earlier, brought by a young woman who'd paid him a modest sum, he estimated around 3,000 pesos, simply to allow the visit and to avoid contradicting whatever explanation she gave the visitor about the nature of his relationship to the business. I remember Rodrigo's face as the full weight of what I was actually describing seemed to land on him as well, a genuine sympathy crossing his features, offering me a cold drink and sitting with me for nearly 20 minutes, translator relaying his careful, kind attempts to help me understand exactly what I was now looking at. I sat down on a plastic chair outside that station, in the middle of an entirely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, traffic moving past on the street beyond, and did the kind of careful, methodical calculation I'd once have applied to any failed engineering project, working backward through 8 months of documented payments, 120,000 euros invested, 17,600 euros returned across those 8 months of apparent profit, leaving a net loss just over 100,000 euros, the majority of my retirement portfolio, extracted through a structure so carefully engineered to satisfy my own specific professional instincts that I understood, sitting there in that plastic chair with Rodrigo's kind, worried face still visible in my peripheral vision, that I hadn't simply been deceived. I'd been studied, with real precision, and then built a fraud specifically calibrated to defeat exactly the defenses I was proudest of possessing, a realization that arrived less as a single dramatic moment and more as a slow, cold settling, the same way a difficult diagnosis takes time to fully register even once the doctor has said the words plainly. I contacted the Dutch police upon returning to Rotterdam and found them genuinely sympathetic. A detective named Vanderberg, spending considerable time walking me through the practical limitations of pursuing a case where both the perpetrator and the fraud itself had occurred entirely outside Dutch jurisdiction, sitting with me in a small interview room for well over an hour, taking careful notes despite what he told me, quite honestly, were limited practical options available to him. Mr. Janssen, we can document what happened. We can flag Sheryl Domingo's name in any relevant international systems, but the actual investigation and prosecution would need to happen through Philippine authorities, and I want to be honest with you about how those cases typically proceed. He wasn't wrong to manage my expectations that carefully. The case I eventually filed with Philippine authorities, through a lawyer I retained specifically for this purpose, a careful, overworked woman named Corazon Reyes, who handled a caseload of similar frauds with a weariness I came to understand reflected the genuine scale of the problem rather than any lack of diligence on her part, sitting across from me in her small, paper-stacked office describing, with real patience, the specific bureaucratic mechanics I could expect to encounter, has remained, for over a year now, in the specific administrative state Filipino legal professionals apparently refer to simply as ongoing, a word I've come to understand, through hard experience, as less a description of active progress and more a location where difficult cases go to quietly live out an indefinite existence, neither closed nor meaningfully advancing. I called Ilsa the week I returned from that trip to Quezon City and told her everything, start to finish, the binder, the stations, the taxi deliveries, the disconnected phone number, the plastic chair outside a legitimate station owned by a man who'd never heard of Cheryl's supposed franchise, sitting in my own kitchen, with the same spreadsheet still open on my laptop screen, the running total sitting there in stark, undeniable red. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, And then she said, with more gentleness than I think I deserved given how dismissively I'd once waved away her early skepticism, "Papa, I asked you if you were sure, back when you first told me about her. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I just noticed she talked exactly like the kind of person who'd know precisely what would impress you." I told her she'd been right, completely right, and that I wished, with a specificity that surprised even me, that I'd taken her instinct as seriously as I'd taken Cheryl's spreadsheet, an admission that cost me something real to say out loud, but that felt, once spoken, like the first honest thing I'd said about the whole affair since it began. I want to explain something about why this particular fraud worked so thoroughly on a man who genuinely believed himself unusually well defended against financial manipulation. Across an entire career, I'd built my professional identity around a specific, disciplined skepticism, the refusal to approve anything based on enthusiasm, romance, or unverified claims. A discipline colleagues used to joke about good-naturedly, calling me the department's resident cynic, a label I wore with genuine pride rather than any discomfort. I was, by every reasonable measure, an unusually difficult person to deceive through emotional appeal alone. What I never once considered, because it had genuinely never occurred to me as a category of risk worth guarding against, was that the exact evidentiary standard I trusted, documentation, physical verification, notarized agreements, could itself be manufactured with sufficient care to satisfy every test I knew to apply. I had spent 38 years building an increasingly sophisticated detector for one specific category of deception, and Sheryl, whether through calculation or instinct, had simply built her fraud in an entirely different category, one my detector had never been calibrated to recognize, because I'd never imagined documentation itself could be the vehicle for the lie rather than the defense against it. I think often now about that visit to the two stations, the specific, genuine satisfaction I felt watching real customers fill real containers at a real counter, and how completely that authentic activity had been repurposed, without the knowledge or complicity of the actual station owners beyond a modest payment for their silence, into evidence supporting an entirely fictional franchise arrangement layered invisibly on top of a real, unconnected business. It's a particular kind of fraud, I've come to understand, that doesn't require fabricating the underlying reality at all, only the relationship between that reality and the investor standing in front of it. A distinction so subtle that even a career built on distinguishing genuine data from fabricated claims never once thought to apply itself to the connective tissue between the two, rather than to either element individually. I don't hate Sheryl, though I want to be honest that this took considerably longer to arrive at than it did with the other losses I've had to process across a difficult life. The divorce, the gradual distance from Ilse's daily life, the ordinary griefs of growing older. I think, turning the whole experience over across many long evenings since, sitting in the same flat where the framed page now hangs, that Sheryl likely operated some version of this same structure with other men before me, and probably continues to, wherever she's currently living, under whatever name she's currently using, a pattern Corazon confirmed she'd seen described in at least 2 other complaints that had crossed her desk over the preceding several years. Cases with different names, different franchise types, a fake resort timeshare in one instance, a purported agricultural export business in another, the same essential architecture of physical verification, satisfied through paid cooperation and documentation, manufactured to satisfy exactly the standard a careful, skeptical investor would think to apply. I don't think that pattern makes what happened to me any less genuinely devastating. Over 100,000 euros representing a substantial portion of a retirement I'd spent 4 decades carefully building, but I've stopped needing Sheryl to have been simply, cartoonishly evil in order for my own losses to make sense. I think she found, somewhere in her own history, a genuinely effective method for extracting money from a specific category of vulnerable, documentation-trusting man, and simply executed that method with real skill against me, the same clinical competence I'd have once admired in an unrelated engineering context. I framed a single page from that original binder, the projected return spreadsheet, laminated exactly as Sheryl had first presented it to me in that conference room, and hung it in my flat in Rotterdam, in the small hallway I pass through every single morning on my way to make coffee. The frame itself a plain black one I bought specifically for the purpose. Nothing decorative about it. Deliberately unremarkable so the page inside remains the only thing worth actually looking at. Ilse thinks it's morbid. Told me so plainly the first time she visited, and saw it hanging there, standing in front of it for a long moment, with an expression somewhere between concern and genuine bafflement, asking why on earth I'd want to look at proof of my own worst financial mistake every single day, rather than simply putting the whole experience behind me, the way any reasonable person recovering from a painful loss would want to. I call it tuition, and I mean that with real precision, rather than as some glib deflection of the genuine pain underneath it. I spent 100,000 euros to learn something about my own specific vulnerability that no amount of professional caution had ever taught me across 38 years of practice, and I've decided, deliberately, that the lesson is worth keeping visible rather than filed away somewhere I could eventually forget its exact shape, the way I suspect I would if I simply packed the whole memory into a drawer, the way Ilse seems to think I should. I've started, since returning fully to life in Rotterdam, meeting occasionally with a small group of other Dutch retirees who've had similar experiences abroad, connected initially through a support forum Corazon herself had recommended, men who'd lost money to romance scams, fraudulent property deals, fake business ventures across a dozen different countries, gathering every few weeks in a quiet cafe near the Erasmusbrug that one of the group had suggested early on. And I've found, somewhat to my own surprise, real value in these conversations, less for any practical recovery of funds, which remains genuinely unlikely for most of us, and more for the specific relief of describing a particular category of shame to people who immediately, completely understand its shape without requiring any defense of how a careful man ended up here. One of them, a retired accountant named Bertus, who'd lost considerably more than I had to a fraudulent resort development in a different country entirely. A man in his early 70s with a dry, understated way of speaking that reminded me faintly of colleagues I'd once worked alongside, told me something during our second meeting that has stayed with me since. Maurice, the thing nobody tells you about being a careful man is that carefulness is a specific tool, calibrated for specific threats. It's not a general-purpose shield. Somebody eventually builds a threat your particular tool was never designed to catch, and when they do, being careful in every other respect doesn't save you. It just makes the whole thing land harder, because you'd built your entire identity around exactly the skill that finally failed you. He said it without any particular drama, simply stating it the way you'd state a settled engineering fact, and I remember sitting with my coffee going cold in front of me, recognizing, with a specific kind of relief, that someone else had arrived at precisely the conclusion I'd been circling for months, without quite managing to articulate it that cleanly myself. I think about that observation often, turning it over the way I once turned over a failed engineering analysis, looking for the precise point where the underlying model had diverged from reality, the exact node in the decision tree where a correct assumption had quietly become an incorrect one, without anyone flagging the transition. I don't believe, even now, that my professional skepticism was somehow false or performative across 38 years of genuine, careful practice. I believe instead that it was real, effective, and precisely bounded, extraordinarily good at catching one category of deception while remaining entirely unequipped to recognize a different category built specifically to satisfy its own criteria. That's a harder lesson to fully absorb than simply concluding I'd been careless, because it requires holding two things simultaneously that don't comfortably fit together. That I was genuinely rigorous in exactly the way I always believed myself to be, and that this rigor was nonetheless, in this one specific and devastating instance, entirely insufficient protection. A distinction I've had to explain more than once to well-meaning friends, who assume the whole story must simply be a case of an old man growing careless in his final working years, when the far more uncomfortable truth is that I was never more careful in my life than I was signing that notarized franchise agreement. I still take the occasional trip abroad, though I've become, by necessity, and by a discipline I've had to consciously rebuild, rather than simply assume I already possessed, a considerably more cautious investor in anything presented to me during those trips, however professionally the proposal happens to be documented, insisting now on independent legal verification of any corporate registration before committing so much as a single euro, a step I once considered unnecessary, given my own capacity for due diligence, and now understand to be the exact category of external check my own professional confidence had once made me too proud to seek out. I tell the newer members of Bertus's group, when the conversation allows for it, the same thing every time, the lesson framed on my own hallway wall. Documentation isn't proof of legitimacy. It's proof that someone understood, with real precision, exactly what kind of proof you personally required, and took the considerable trouble to manufacture it specifically for you. I spent 38 years learning to trust the paperwork over the person presenting it. I never once considered that the most sophisticated fraud I'd ever encounter would be a person who'd spent considerably less time than I had learning to build exactly the paperwork I trusted, and who understood, correctly, that a man who distrusts emotion is not the same thing as a man who cannot be deceived. He's simply a man whose deception, when it finally arrives, will be dressed in a language he was never taught to doubt. I've thought, more than once, about writing to Rodrigo, the station owner who spoke so kindly with me that afternoon, simply to thank him for his honesty and his patience with a foreign stranger asking difficult, confused questions about a business he'd built with his own hands and his own careful savings. I haven't yet found the words, or perhaps I've simply been reluctant to reopen that particular chapter more than the framed page on my wall already requires of me each morning. I understand, sitting here now, some considerable distance from that plastic chair outside his station, that Rodrigo lost nothing in this whole affair beyond an afternoon, and I suspect, a small measure of his own peace of mind at having unknowingly participated, however innocently, in something that cost a stranger everything he'd carefully calculated his retirement would require. I think about him more often than I think about Sheryl, if I'm honest. A genuinely decent man caught at the edge of a fraud that was never actually about him at all, simply borrowing his real, honest work as a prop in a story someone else had written entirely for my benefit and to my considerable cost. I don't know that I've fully closed the account on any of this, in the way accountants speak of closing a ledger, every figure reconciled, every question finally cleanly answered. I suspect I never fully will. What I have managed, slowly, across the better part of 2 years now, is to stop needing the account closed in order to keep living reasonably well within whatever remains of a retirement I once imagined would look considerably different than it now does. The framed page still hangs in the hallway, exactly where I placed it that first week back. I still pass it every morning on my way to make coffee. Most days now, it doesn't stop me the way it once did. It simply reminds me, briefly and without much drama, that I am the kind of man who can be studied, and that studying itself, however careful, however thorough, is never quite the same thing as being safe.